Marta had always been a master at hiding her insecurities. Her beauty, grace, and ability to make every room seem brighter masked the emptiness she felt deep inside. Her husband, Eric, adored her, showering her with gifts and affection, at least in the beginning. But as their years together wore on, his attention drifted toward his growing business, leaving Marta to confront a lonely existence. They had married young, both eager for the future, but as their late 30s approached, Marta found herself yearning for something more. Her heart broke every time Eric brushed off their discussions of children. "We have time," he'd say, already lost in his phone or business meetings. But Marta knew their time was running out. The pressure to be a mother weighed heavily on her, especially when her friends, one by one, seemed to announce pregnancies or births. Eric seemed indifferent, caught up in his world of clients and deals, leaving Marta to her mounting anxiety. Then, an idea formed. If she couldn't conceive, maybe pretending to be pregnant would reignite Eric's love and attention. It started innocently enough, a little morning sickness, a few skipped periods, and then the fateful day when she showed him a fake positive pregnancy test. His face lit up, and for the first time in years, he was looking at her, really looking at her. She basked in the warmth of his newfound tenderness. Months went by, and Marta's deception grew. She bought pregnancy clothes, wore padding to make her stomach appear swollen, and avoided intimate moments that might reveal the truth. Eric's excitement grew alongside the lie, and he started talking about building a nursery, about names and future plans. But the closer they got to the supposed due date, the more restless Marta became. She had no plan to explain the sudden absence of a child. She tried to stall Eric's enthusiasm, claiming fatigue or the need to rest. But he wouldn't let up. One night, as they sat down to dinner, Eric casually mentioned hiring a midwife to help with the home birth, given Marta's supposed fear of hospitals. Panic flooded her chest, and she excused herself from the table, running to the bathroom to collect her thoughts. How had she allowed it to go this far? How could she get out? Eric grew suspicious in the following days. The energy that once filled their home vanished, replaced by Marta's nervous silence and avoidance. He noticed the inconsistencies, the way her bump never quite seemed right, the way she flinched at the word baby. Then, it happened. He found the padding in the laundry hamper, hastily stuffed under towels. The truth hit him like a truck. His wife, the woman he trusted more than anyone, had lied. He confronted her that evening, his voice low but dangerous, asking her to explain. Tears streamed down Marta's face as she tried to tell him everything. How she was desperate for his love, how she thought a baby would fix things, how she couldn't bear the idea of losing him. But her words did little to calm Eric. His anger surged, uncontrolled. His entire life felt like a farce, a cruel joke. In a blind rage, he lunged at her, pushing her against the kitchen counter. Marta stumbled backward, hitting her head hard on the marble edge. She collapsed to the floor, her body still. Eric stood frozen, his breath ragged, unable to comprehend what he'd done. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of his heart pounding in his ears. Marta's lifeless body lay at his feet, the weight of their deception crushing them both. In the end, the lie that was meant to save their marriage had destroyed them instead. Eric stared at Marta's body, his hands trembling as the reality of what had happened began to sink in. He wanted to scream, to rewind time, to undo the impulsive rage that had ended everything. But no matter how much he wished it, Marta lay still, her once vibrant spirit now gone. For what felt like hours, Eric stood motionless. His thoughts raced. Panic set in. What was he supposed to do? Call the police? They would never believe him. He'd seen the true crime shows. The moment he called for help, he'd be branded as the killer. His hands were already stained, his guilt was certain, and there was no going back. But then a thought took root, cold and calculating. No one knew about the fight. No one knew the truth behind Marta's fake pregnancy. To the outside world, she was still expecting, still the glowing mother-to-be. If he could buy time, if he could control the narrative, maybe, just maybe, he could salvage something from this nightmare. His mind worked quickly, adrenaline pushing him to action. He knelt beside her, checking for any signs of life, though he knew she was gone. Her pulse was silent. Her breathing, non-existent. Eric took a deep breath and made his decision. He lifted her body gently, cradling her as though she were still alive. With deliberate care, he carried her to the bedroom, laying her down on the bed. She looked peaceful, almost as though she were simply sleeping. Eric stood over her, his heart pounding in his chest, his mind spinning with the logistics of what he had to do next. He reached for his phone, his hands shaking as he dialed the number of an ambulance. His voice cracked, but he steadied it, explaining in a frantic whisper that his wife had fallen, that she was pregnant, that she wasn't breathing. The dispatcher on the other end of the line asked him to stay calm, to perform CPR, but Eric knew it was useless. Still, he mimicked their instructions. if only to keep up the act. Minutes later, the sound of sirens cut through the eerie quiet of the house. Paramedics arrived, rushing inside to find Marta in bed, her face pale, her skin cold. They worked on her for a few moments, but it was clear to them, too, she was beyond saving. Eric played the part of the grieving husband well. He wept openly, repeating over and over how she had slipped, how she had hit her head and he couldn't save her. His tears were real, the weight of his actions pressing down on him with each passing second. But he knew he couldn't let them see past his grief to the truth lurking beneath it. The paramedics called time of death. It was official now, Marta was gone. As they prepared to transport her body, Eric was left alone in the house, suffocating in the silence that followed. Over the next few days, the lie took on a life of its own. The small town was rocked by the news of Marta's tragic death, the shock made worse by the fact that she had been pregnant. Neighbors and friends, all of whom had believed Marta's story, rallied around Eric. They brought food, flowers, words of comfort, and sympathy. Every kind gesture was a knife in his chest, a reminder of the deception he had crafted, one that had led to her death. But the truth, like all secrets, had a way of creeping to the surface. A few weeks after Marta's death, an investigator visited Eric. The doctor who had overseen Marta's pregnancy wanted to express his condolences, but he had been confused when he learned Marta had never visited his office in months. Something wasn't adding up, and questions began to swirl about her pregnancy. The autopsy only deepened the mystery. There was no evidence Marta had ever been pregnant. The investigator asked Eric questions, subtle at first, probing. Eric did his best to maintain the facade, repeating the same story of her fall, but his mind was unraveling. The weight of guilt, the pressure of the lie, it was all too much. He barely slept. Each day that passed brought new doubts, new fears. He saw Marta's face every time he closed his eyes, heard her voice in the quiet moments when the house was empty. And then, on a cold October evening, it all came crashing down. Eric sat alone at the kitchen table, the same table where their final argument had started, when he heard a knock at the door. Two detectives stood on the porch, their expressions grim. "We need to ask you some questions about your wife's death," one of them said, his voice sharp, cutting through the night air like a blade. Eric's heart sank. They knew. Or at least, they were close to knowing. The lie had spiraled out of control, and there was no more time to hide. He nodded, stepping aside to let them in. As they sat across from him, their questions probing deeper and deeper, Eric realized that this was the end. He couldn't escape what he had done. Marta's death had been an accident, yes, but it was an accident born from a lie. And now, the lie had consumed him, leaving nothing but the cold, hollow truth in its wake. With trembling hands, Eric poured himself a glass of water, his voice shaking as he began to speak. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," he whispered. And with that, the facade crumbled. Eric's confession poured out slowly, like poison seeping into the room. He told the detectives everything: the faked pregnancy, his desperate need to hold on to Marta, and how the lie had spiraled out of control. As he spoke, his voice cracked under the weight of his guilt, his body trembling with every word. The detectives listened, their faces unreadable, but they had heard enough. Eric was handcuffed and led out of the house that had once been his home, now a tomb of his darkest secrets. Days later, the town was buzzing with the scandal. Everyone who had known Marta and Eric as the perfect couple now saw them in a different light. The whispers in grocery stores, the murmurs in the cafe, they all revolved around the Hendersons. How could such a beautiful life crumble so quickly? The court case was swift. Eric's lawyer tried to argue that the death had been accidental, a tragic slip during a moment of heated passion. But the prosecution pointed to the rage-fueled confrontation, the years of lies, and the deception that had led to Marta's death. They framed it as more than just an accident. It was the result of Eric's growing obsession and his inability to confront the truth. As Eric sat in the courtroom, watching the evidence pile up against him, he knew there was no redemption. His heart ached with the weight of his actions. He had loved Marta in his own way, but his love had become twisted, warped by insecurity and desperation. Marta had faked a pregnancy to keep him, but in the end, it was that very lie that tore them apart. The jury deliberated for only a few hours. When they returned, the foreman stood and delivered the verdict: guilty of manslaughter. Eric felt the world collapse around him. He had expected this outcome, but hearing it aloud felt like a final nail in the coffin of his life. The judge sentenced him to 12 years in prison, with a possibility of parole after 8. A long time, but not enough to erase the weight of what he had done. As the years passed, Eric sat in his cell, haunted by memories of Marta. His mind replayed that final night over and over. The lies, the arguments, the moment of violence that had shattered everything. No matter how many times he closed his eyes and imagined a different ending, he couldn't escape the truth. In trying to save their love, he had destroyed it. In the end, All that was left was regret. And a love that could never be restored, because it had been built on lies.